Hello, hello, hello. Welcome again to another episode of Straight Talk for Business. This series is going to be focusing the main messages around Tame the Turmoil, which is a bit of a carryover from a book that I recently released and which has become a #1 bestseller. Today, I'm excited to have my guest, Ed Bernacki, as the first guest in the series. And it also ties into an article that I recently published about innovation. And this is really intended to be a very short chapter that is not in the book. The link for that paper is going to be in the captions below when this recording is posted on YouTube. And for all others who are listening to the podcast, it will also be available through that. So let me introduce you to Ed Bernacki. I have known Ed for over 20 years now as a really clever thinker around innovation. And he's had lots of wonderful ideas over the years, and many of which he's going to share in this podcast. And Ed is actually the inventor of something called the Innovation Journal. Now, instead of me going on and telling you what that is, I am going to turn it over to Ed, introduce you to the Innovation Journal, and then I have a series of questions that I would like to ask Ed. It's really going to be, quite conversational. It isn't going to be a drill. So let's kick it off. Ed, welcome,
Thank
and
you.
tell us about the Innovation Journal and how it came to be.
Oh, the original idea started for the idea of these journals was complete accident in a way. I had a partner talking the late 1990s here who just had who knew the editor of Inc. magazine, and they just had a casual conversations once about joking around that Inc. has a whole conference division, and it was the editor saying that kind of like I look around these people who come here and take notes, and I bet they never even look at their notes again. And he sort of joked and said, "Well, what could we do to make this more effective?" Well, that looked like a kind of an interesting problem, and it started off by notion like, well, what's an effective conference participant look like? So, okay, part of this work means you've got to build up some meaning. So we just started thinking, well, the point of a conference is not for people to come and make notes. It's actually to come to learn, to engage. And then we started making stuff up. Well, if you can learn and engage, you could collaborate with people to solve something. You could be thinking in your own head that here's a couple of company problems or whatever sector you work for. I will focus on those issues during the event. So all of this then led to, well, how do we make that happen? And it was just a silly observation that the common tool at most conferences is the hotel pad of paper. Quite often like or the sponsor's pad of paper. And it became from that and said, well, what could you replace that pad of paper with that would give people some new skills for taking notes more effectively, but also all the processes involved with conferences, picking workshops, how to network, how to listen actively, how to make notes actively. So we kind of reinvented the whole process. And these became some kind of content pages in our journal that we suggested. And the rest of it was just note pages. And the editor of Inc. loved the idea and said, okay, create that and we'll take 4,000 copies for the year.
Oh, nice.
And at that point, all we had were some basic sketches of what pages could look like.
So
Um,
did you have to, because it sounds to me like this was really for the engagement of the attendees, but how would the presenters at various conferences be aware of this journal, and how would they, should they, might they fashion their presentation so that it fits in along with the thinking of the journal, or is that something that evolved over time?
no, that did evolve over time. What we realized was that At first it looked like this fancy little book and people didn't quite understand it. So we realized that this has to be introduced properly. And so again, pulling it back to the innovation word, you kind of always, if you can help people solve a problem, you're three-quarters of the way there. I learned that the quickest way to introduce this concept would be for someone, and I did this a number of times too, speak at the front of the conference before it starts and say, we're just going to take a couple of minutes here to help you get some more value from the conference. Just checking. How many people here have come to an event like this, taken notes, and never looked at them again?
Oh, yeah.
And,
So
and you put
common.
their hand up, and soon everyone's got their hand up. And you kind of laugh and you think, and you kind of go, you know how ridiculous that is. Well, that's the problem, and you have a solution in your hands. And all
It
they
was,
need is
and so this journal was given
guide.
out to them as part of the conference
Yes,
material.
at the beginning of the conference, yeah. So everyone got one. Sorry, I should have mentioned at registration, they would get a journal. And so some people got it right away, and other people weren't quite sure because it's different. Um, but even in this digital world, I'm still finding that it's a lot better to be kind of focused on a notebook than a phone
Yeah.
because if you're going to pay money to go to the conference, don't be checking your emails, don't be looking on stuff. Like even when the conference programs now quite often have an app, well, if you check your app, you're highly likely to check everything else that comes in. And to me, I think the whole idea behind these journals, but also in the context of events, is that our events should be like a little bastion of opportunity to think and to learn and to think
Agreed.
and collaborate. You're meeting people, you might work at home, but here you're in front of people. It's a great potential to kind of innovate. Like,
So, so
and
take so taken what you've just said.
yeah,
Um, the phone is kind of one barrier to engagement, if you will, in a conference. But if you take this setting to a workplace environment, let's say whether you're in a big corporation or whether you're an entrepreneur with a small business, what do you think are some of the main barriers that you see around innovation?
yeah.
You came up with a journal because there was a barrier you were overcoming, and it's that engagement. But in big business or small business, regardless, what do you think are some of the biggest barriers to innovation?
Um, I've kind of been around this for a long time. And I've also worked in Canada, the US, New Zealand, Australia. I lived there. Also worked in Singapore and a few other countries. Um, I have to say the number one observation I have is lack of clarity of what innovation actually means.
So why don't you
Uh,
go into that a bit?
Pardon me, sorry.
Maybe go into that a bit.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I Where it hit me was I had a meeting, this is a long time ago, in the lobby of IBM in Toronto. And they had all these banners, innovation is what we do. And so I just tongue in cheek asked the woman and she was a manager there. And I said, well, what does this actually mean? And she kind of looked and went, I don't really know. And it was like, this is IBM. It's like, even a company like that, they may use the term innovation as a banner and we kind of sort of get it. But I think that, and I saw this best illustrated, I think, in a couple of public sector areas. But I just think there's so much confusion between the concept of innovation and technology. So you'll hear terms like our innovation industry is, and I'm thinking, why would you think technology is an innovation industry? It's just an industry. It may be innovative, it may not be. Um, Same thing with, are we talking about innovation in startups and entrepreneurship? That kind of gets muddled up as well. Um, Innovation versus improvement. That I find quite like it's so often if people do anything, they will call it innovation. And if you rationally look at it, you go, no, you just improve something here. Now, nothing wrong with improvement, but I just focus on two things. One country had a definition of innovation, and this is coming from the person at the very top who said the point of innovation is not about something new or something cool, it's about improvement. And I listen to that and go, no, it's not. Like, you're the boss, you're the head, you're the chief. You're supposed to show some vision. Okay. I wrote an innovation guide years ago based on in Singapore for the public service. And I was using some of their words and some of my words, but their definition I thought was really insightful. It's more like an explanation with it. Innovation is more than improvement. Improvements are important, but innovations are like a quantum improvement that breaks new ground to create value in new ways. And I'm thinking that is really interesting. Breaks new ground. You can tell a whole story around that. Creates
Yeah,
value in new ways.
you just said something that really sparked something I read actually quite a long time ago. Well, a few years ago. There's an author by the name of Robert Greene. He wrote a book called Mastery, and it's a very, very insightful book. And in there, I remember him defining that innovation is a combination of creativity and adaptability. And I've been on this song and dance about adaptability for a number of years now, because there comes a point where you're done with improving. You've just now got to break it and do something different, right? What do you think about that? The combination of creativity and adaptability. I think kind of, to me, it really said it all. What do you think about that idea?
It makes total sense. Um, because when you're going forward, okay, all you're doing is trying to solve problems.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay. We're going forward, we're making plans, we see this issue, and it might have an upside or it might not have an upside. You need to be creative. And as far as I'm concerned, everyone in every organization works on problems. Um, you can be skilled for that. There's courses, there's all kinds of models, things, and even simple frameworks like getting the definition of the problem right the first time. Okay. The second part of that, though, is you also have to be able to implement it. But you have to be able to turn into action. So I'm thinking that's what the adaptability means. I assume that's what he's trying to get at, is that you still have to be able to act it, like put it in action somehow.
execute it the way
Yeah.
it's intended
Yeah.
effectively. Yeah,
The other thought of this is something years ago when I was in New Zealand, I heard Edward de Bono at a presentation. Got invited to this, and he said that people think you can see innovation going forward, and he went, "No, you can't. You only see innovation looking backward.
yeah.
Because going forward, like I said before, you're just solving problems. You're trying to create something which you hope like heck actually works. Um, you're there's and only when you're kind of looking backward and you can see, you know what, we solved that really well. But going to the Singapore one, it broke new ground. It created new value we didn't expect. And
Yeah.
okay, that to me is where you start getting into what the real innovation work does. Otherwise, it's just effective problem solving. Okay.
So
Nothing.
then, having said all that, they back to the biggest barrier in organizations to innovation. I have a thought on that, and I'd like to know what you think. In my experience, what I've seen, across the many different countries I've worked in, like you, is that everybody seems to like, particularly at the senior levels of organization, they like to put a deadline on innovation. And one of the things I've learned is that there's no time boundaries for innovation. Is you need to take the time you need to take the time. What do you think? Is time and the expectation that it's going to be done in 30 days is that unreasonable? Is
I
that
mean,
a
sometimes, okay, it's not like there's one answer to this one. going back to that notion around that journal we created with ink, when he said, "Okay, let's do this," we had nothing. Okay, we had nothing. We had some little sketches on paper. That then became a time issue because they wanted to launch them in, I'm sorry, 6 months or something, which is easy if you have a product. We didn't have one. So that was a deadline driven thing. Three of us worked together. We met for about a week and just did this. Okay, that's one. But this issue around time, it links into something too that we both involved with risk management issues that I found most interesting is that executives should make a kind of a distinction between the in terms of managing risk and say new initiatives. Is this initiative needed to solve a problem? There is no upside to this. There's no reward if this is solved. It has to stop the bleeding, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. High sense of urgency. It's the sooner you fix it. Um, a transit system that keeps breaking down. There is no upside to fixing this. The expectations are already damaged for the public. You just got to fix it. Conversely, other kinds of initiatives could have a very positive spin on if it worked really well. And this is that notion of rewarded risk, where sure, it's a risk, but we should kind of cut some slack around this because a simple solution with a bit more could actually be really, really interesting. And that notion of kind of looking at the problem and the type of solution you need, or the solution you could create, um, there's, I think, great value in that in terms of, and with this notion around time, if there's an upside to this, where if this works really well, and it could become something bigger where value gets created in new ways, give it some slack. And this is what the research has found, that these are the ways that you can kind of create bigger opportunities.
Mhm.
And maybe the crazy opportunity is helping other companies solve the same problem that you just solved. Um, I once worked with New Zealand Post, and they really reinvented a lot of their systems. And then they spun off an international consulting division of some of their executives who sort of wanted to retire, started working overseas. And I only learned a little bit too late, but the director I worked for ended up becoming the managing director. And then he decided, I've had enough of this. He joined their consulting firm. He spent 6 months with Canada Post in Ottawa.
Out of
And
New
this is,
Zealand.
yeah, yeah, he's from New Zealand. Sorry, I should have said that for clarify. This
But
is
no,
from New
you
Zealand.
did. But I mean, to go from New
And here
Zealand
we
to
have this little tiny country that was innovating their postal systems that he had already done, I think, an extensive term in the UK post office as well, because it's small enough that they could move quickly to launch things, to do things. And that's where some of my roots, I spent a couple of years working there. Um, and this kind of leads into the same issue that one of the things I've also found out is it's something that I read in a document recently, that how do you promote innovation when it's not part of your job description? And I sort of thought about that and went, wait a minute, would you say the same thing around problem solving? Well, problem solving is part of everybody's job description. I don't care whether you're the receptionist, the mail person, you need to solve problems. And when I realized one of the projects I worked on at the post office was we were part of a small, almost like an innovation team in today's language. There was no way we could solve all the problems. So I worked on materials to prompt managers all through the organization, all across the country, because it's very spread out. That I created like kits with information and toolkits on how and to prompt them to meet with their staff once a week to work on one problem. And I
so you
had that
raise
would
go
build
ahead.
that culture of ideas.
Right. So you I was right into what I was thinking. That the whole culture issue, and particularly I'm going to say the last 5 years,
Yeah.
we've had, it's been a challenging time. So much of the world has been like tossed into chaos. And, there's more and more and more um, emphasis on having a culture of innovation. But, what you just said, you don't have a culture of problem solving, so what do you think executives, managers, leaders in companies, what do you think, some of their one or two top strategies should be to get everybody thinking? It's again, it's like, I say risk belongs with every person. It belongs on every desk in an organization, whether you're in the office or whether you're not. The remote work doesn't remove anybody from being able to think innovatively, from being able to solve problems, or to be able to identify risk. So, what do you think are one or two strategies that businesses really need to put in place to foster this kind of culture?
Well, I'd put it that to something that came out of some research that I read, and so somebody who led very big organizations that said that innovation always has two problems in organizations. The first problem is actually innovating solutions. Now that could be products. So that your first challenge is continually to be able to launch new initiatives. Okay.
Mhm.
That means you have to be pretty good at change because that's what innovation creates. Like something that truly is an innovation creates change. Um, so the first challenge, like I said, was to be able to create this, to be able to continually invent new products, services, promotion, or processes, or whatever your organization does. But the second challenge that they said was building staff skills and capabilities to be able to do the first challenge. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah.
I think that that is the biggest weakness that I see. We want those innovative solutions and products and services, but organizations really don't build the skills of staff to kind of generate ideas, develop them, manage them. They don't necessarily create the opportunities. Um, I'll give you a tiny example of something that it was only looking back at my first job in a nonprofit that I realized how useful this was. We just had like it wasn't even a formal strategy. It was just an approach that every year we wanted to create one new revenue source. Okay, we're a nonprofit sports association. We wanted to get one new revenue source. So this could be a new program. One year we decided to launch a magazine. Knew nothing of magazines, but we thought that can improve communications, but it could also interest sponsors. There's advertising, and it would be great for all kinds of reasons. Um, the second part of that was we picked one program to review each year. And it was like doing, in today's language, I'd call it, we did an audit, like an efficiency effectiveness audit. What's working, what's not working, how do we improve it? Because stuff was basically okay, but how could you make it better?
Mhm.
And now in retrospect, I'm thinking that's actually really smart. Like that's like a de facto innovation strategy. Create one new thing a year means you got to be thinking forward. Uh, what new kind of initiative can you take? And this was not just extending something a little. That's just like that's effectiveness. This was kind of launching something. We started a trade show conference that those things continued for about 20 years. They were revenue sources and they were really good for membership value. I mean, that would be one thing to kind of going back to the beginning is that this notion about your first challenge is to be able to, that you need to be able to create things. Second one around building the capacity of staff to do that.
Yeah.
But even having a de facto strategy that says we're going to try to pick one new thing a year to kind of one new revenue source, and then try to and the other and that's your innovation. The other part you could call it your improvement. How do we do something that we're already doing? And we were looking for other revenue things, but so it kind of came down to there wasn't anything wrong with what we were doing because the associate was quite successful, but it was always around how do we make little improvements? Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
those things it made a big difference. Now, getting to the culture, one of the issues was that I didn't know anything about this work. I just was pretty good at ideas, and I used to run into my boss's office and go, Brian, I got this idea for something, and he got kind of fed up with this and said, like, why don't you write it down and we'll meet every week to talk about your ideas? And what ended up happening was, well, two things. One, I would write something down on a Monday, do something. Well, the fact that I wrote it down, that discipline of that, quite often I started having more ideas about the first one. And so by the time our Thursday meetings came around, quite often I'd have a whole page of notes about how to do something. He would sit there thinking, where did this stuff come from? Now, what then happened was other staff started getting involved. So we started to have this ad hoc weekly idea meeting. And it was basically just to discuss any new ideas that came up that people worked on, or if anyone had a problem they were working on, they could use staff in this kind of forum to kind of brainstorm with. And I mean that sounds so simple. There's no cost to that. It was a meeting, but it was a highly effective meeting. It was opted. People liked it. It was fun. And because you're kind of generating ideas, there's like that creativity and there's kind of a positive spin to things.
Yeah.
And I think just something like that. Um, the other thought I kept having too around this work now on the bigger level is when I was still living in Australia, I was asked by a professor I knew to teach in a Masters of Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Commercialization program. And this was most of the students were engineers or project managers. The next degree that they were getting was this a Masters of Innovation. My course was at the front end of that work, and that was really around the creativity side, how to solve problems better. What's your style of thinking? How to work with people who don't think like you, kind of the mechanical stuff.
Hmm.
Other courses were on more hardcore commercialization strategies, um, how to launch. I can't even remember launching them. But what it meant was I was designed going back to that process I mentioned about the training was to help people launch new products, but the university degree also did the second part, which is how do you build the skills and capacity of an organization to innovate. Now, my whole point of this is I don't know why innovation is not taught in every management school. Every MBA program should have innovation courses. I'm sure some do. Um, but I know, for example, in Canada, a few years ago, a report came out from the Canadian Council of Academies kind of bemoaning the fact that Canadian universities are not teaching innovation management.
No.
If we think it's so important, there's just tons of core content you can study. Um, an innovation strategy is not a suggestion box program. Okay. Like that's just a little tiny tactic. That's not a strategy. But
But
if you
but it
do
does
that,
highlight something though. As you were talking, I was thinking about the suggestion box idea
yeah,
because there's a capabilities question here. You talk about having the skills and then talk about having the capacity, right? To me, capabilities includes a third element, which is the willingness to take action. And I
yeah,
think this was the biggest downfall of the suggestion box. There was a lot of skilled people with a lot of different skills that were putting suggestions forward. They had the capacity, obviously, they were thinking about stuff, um, it was, about improvement, but sometimes it was about groundbreaking new
yeah,
stuff, right?
yeah,
Altogether. And then the thing that brought down the suggestion box was that lack of willingness,
yeah.
I think, to take action. And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about in the school system. Think back to what we were teaching at Schulich. Who's going to take action?
Well, the greatest irony of the whole suggestion box program is that people never actually got that it wasn't that many years ago where um, for about 75 years there was an organization called the Employee Engagement Association.
Oh,
Essentially, it was
never
an
heard.
association for organizations that had suggestion box programs. And this started in like the 1940s. It later became called Ideas America. And it was basically training managers on how to run those programs to have things in place. How do you judge them? What are all the processes? And I'm just going to turn around for a second because I just saw this. these professors, Alan Robinson and Dean Schroeder, wrote a book called The Idea-Driven Organization. And I met them at one of these conferences, and they had done research on 300 suggestion box programs from government, public sector, nonprofits, and they looked at the mechanics of all of these things. It was absolutely unique. And the book they called it was I think the first book was called Ideas Are Free.
Yeah.
And it was like they were talking about that the companies do this well, have this endless supply of ideas coming from staff, but you do it badly and they don't work. Um, so this book, the idea-driven organization, there is a whole chapter in here on all the mechanics of how to make these things work. And I think now, so going back to part of this is I think there's just not enough core knowledge in our out there in our management and our around this notion of idea management. How do you manage ideas inside of an organization? And it's nothing to do with databases here. Okay, I don't mean it in that sense.
Mhm.
Um, it's you have a suggestion. How do you go from kind of a rough insight to something that's actually worth looking at? What happens to it? Who do you give it to? What are these like? Have they thought through these internal processes to manage ideas? I mean, going back to my idea meeting story, I had a direct line to the boss, basically. I would run into his office. It was a small organization. And he kind of got it that because I had given him some pretty cool stuff, he'd actually take me seriously. Um, I've also been in other situations where you're not respected. If you have ideas, you're kind of a troublemaker. Like,
Yeah.
why can't you be happy with the way things are around here?
Yeah.
Um, so I'm, I think this goes back to that point about the lack of fundamental education on this. Um, But I will make one sidebar on this. A lot of organizations started buying essentially digital suggestion box programs. It'll sit on the web or it'll sit on your intranet, this sort of thing. The software companies, though, they found a way to kind of make this process mechanical, and you can get all kinds of statistics. But they didn't train people in organizations on how to get the systems used. That's what they used to do for 75 years. They had certification programs on marketing your system, the mechanics, how do you judge ideas? Who's judge? All those kinds of things that you need to. Who's going to advance it? But where did the budgets come from? Um, I mean, one aspect of this came up a long time ago was it was Polaroid Corporation when they were really trying to beef up their innovation in the 90s. I mean, they saw some issues coming, but they realized that you have to budget money for ideas that you don't have yet if you take this work seriously.
And
Okay.
is that where the risk factor comes into the conversation? Because it seems to me that way too many people are equating risk with, innovation is too risky. Well, since when is problem solving too risky?
Okay.
Same thing, right?
Yeah,
So
I'm also
how
a
do we
communicator of the
dispel
sort.
that notion?
Um, what you've just said there, a long time ago, and I've written a lot of articles around it, and I realized there's a hierarchy of here. Some people you can talk about creativity in organizations and they get it. We need creative thinkers, and some of the executives get that.
Yeah.
Some think that's flaky. So then you can talk about innovation. We need innovation in this, and the executives, well, it's kind of more business-like. But then they can think that, well, innovation is too risky. Then I would drop it to the third level, which is problem solving. And it's really hard to argue that problem solving is not important. Like, which problems do you want not to be solved? Like, is problem solving optional? Not really. Um, the
Right.
well, that is actually one of the other kind of a speaking tools I've used is that we'll be more innovative when we can get around to it when we've got the time. And as if it's an option. And if you want to, a useful way to get buy-in from something, kind of frame it around this notion that people think that being innovative is an option. Well, if so, what's the other option? What's the option of not being innovative, accepting the status quo? You know,
Well,
it
if
could,
you're not moving forward, you're dying, right? Is the old
well,
adage.
it's just trying to give you that. It's almost like a decision tree analysis, the do nothing option versus the options you have. A little operations knowledge, though, doesn't hurt. I'm hoping people kind of understand what a decision tree looks like. Um, when you have a problem and then you can have different options. One option is always do nothing. And then the point of that was you could kind of list, well, the chance of this happening is like this, or but that also allows you to step back and look at each option separately. And I think there's real value in that kind of planning. I think we've talked about this once before around the this notion around risk. I also think we need another option to this, which is the risk in risk management is that something's not going to work. It could fail. Okay.
It's one option.
Yeah. So we spend a lot of time focusing on plans to create success.
Hmm.
But what kind of prompted me on this one is that, okay, here's our 10-page strategy for success. Step back from that and have this second thing around risk, which is what could screw up the fastest that's going to ruin us, and brainstorm a second list. I wish there was a US professor that I once saw who talked about this. And his whole notion was planning for failure. Because if you can plan for failure, you can avoid failure. That was his whole thing. And usually there's a small number of elements that could really screw up. We talked about those conference journals. My number one failure was they don't arrive on time. You know, if the conference is there, started, and the courier companies haven't delivered them, that's a failure. If you screw up with some spelling mistakes or some typos or something, okay, nobody's really going to care about that. But my number one was it must arrive on time. Um, what I found in the real world was it's almost like you have your to-do list for success and you have your to avoid list to prevent failure. And I mean, I've done it as in actually working with a group on two flip charts. What do we have to avoid? And I find that as a really powerful conversation because that is like a version of risk management. If you
Well, we
avoid the
could
things that are
actually
going
we
to
could we
fail,
could
it's not
talk
about
about that. We could talk about it all day long because I would very much disagree with you on that approach.
okay.
Um, because, and I'll put it very simply this way, instead of making two lists, if you have your which is what we do in the risk management program, is you've got to know what it's going to take to succeed.
Yeah.
Plain and simple. As soon as you can find out where your gaps are,
Yeah.
those are your failure points.
Yeah.
And so I encourage people to focus on one thing because if you put them over here for what it's going to take to fail, what it's going to take to succeed, I have found that people get really confused with that.
Okay.
And so if we can just focus them
Well,
on what's it going to take to succeed, where are the gaps?
okay.
It,
I
it
think we're doing the same thing. You called it where are the gaps? That would be to me the same thing. I I would just write
what
that gap over here. That's all. You see what I'm getting at? But that's exactly what I'm trying to get at is
okay.
that gap is probably your a failure point
The
of
fail
some
point.
sort.
Yeah.
Um, but no, that's I'll tell you where you do learn a lot of this. My first job, we did a lot of events. And I have to say, the planning for events taught me a lot about this kind of work because you you don't get a second chance to do an event. Your planning has to be almost like perfect the first time because it's Saturday at 10 o'clock. It's happening at 10. You either succeed or you fail, and real fast. And this was my first degree was in sports management. And part of that was on included project and event planning, like basic stuff, setting some objectives. What are we trying to achieve here? What are the actions and what are the key strategies? So at least you had a discipline for planning. But the fact that they're events to me actually really gave if you just change the word from say innovation and taking initiative, well, it's almost the same thing with an event. Like it's you're taking action. You want to maximize the value of it. You want to find out what those gaps are because once it's happened, it's too late. Like it doesn't do you any good to find the gaps when you're at the event and you realize you didn't bring something. Um, I mean, you've probably seen that too with conferences. It's not so much now, it's the technology's better, but they didn't check the technology before the PowerPoint didn't talk to the computer, or they'd have to
How often
reboot,
has that happened?
that kind of thing, where that's your, as a speaker, that's your job. So you don't blame the tech people for that. You have to check this stuff.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those are where you're looking for. But that's what I mean by events. I actually find it quite interesting because you could look at innovation as a series of events. We're going to launch this when we have to prepare. There is an element of timing. Um, the I mean, one of the journals I created kind of played with this idea, but um, we understand time management pretty well. What I don't think we understand is idea management. I think it's a whole, that's what my journals have always been about. But then I thought, how do you get people to manage ideas over time? And this is where I just came up with a simple model of 12 months, 12 challenges. It's kind of if you think of like a calendar or a book with months in it, that you just start assigning, I got to work on this stuff next year. You just pick a month, you're going to work on it. Like you can't do it all at once. Like any strategy, any plan, or any act, like 10-point action plan. Okay, you can't do it all now. Don't try. Um, Assign something to August, assign something to September, and just write it down. I'm going to work on a program to do this in September. And that's it.
Well, now you're
If
into discipline.
Well, that's it. But you know what? Now I got to say, in the real world, what started to happen, because I created a journal around this, I started getting people telling me that because they wrote it down, you're also planting a seed of that in your brain. Um, there's a group here in the military that use this quite a bit. And the one can tell me that every time, quite often, a conversation in May would spur some insight for his September project. And then it went all to hell because he started getting so excited about the September project, he just started working on it. And I'm thinking, this is great. I mean, what you're doing, I don't really, because the journal is there to prompt initiative. I don't care if you do it in September or not. And he just found that over time, there's that they would be at some event and he started getting ideas for things. So by the time he got to work on something, say in October, he might already have a half a page of notes and links. I should read this article or here's this, just things to do with that issue. That to me is brilliant. It's almost like your personal idea management strategy. Um, I've always said that that's a kind of like time management gives you structure. But Rosabeth Moss Kanter, quite a few years ago at Harvard, did research on what stops people from being creative on the job. And I never forgot this. Her number one factor was, and I think a lot of people get this, I don't have time.
Yeah.
I don't have time to be creative. And my little brain was going, well, we have this multi-million-dollar time management industry. Well, what are people learning in time management if they don't have time to be innovative?
Well,
Like,
don't you think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that it isn't so much the time. I agree with you. Time management is crucial, but there's absolutely no slack built into the time. I mean, I remember you and I go back, think all the years ago where if you had an 8-hour workday,
yeah,
you actually weren't working 8 hours. You were maybe working six,
yeah,
and you had slack, right? And there was,
yeah,
if you were on vacation, somebody had enough that they could cover. Today, there's
yeah,
no slack in
yeah.
anything, right? You're go, 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 go from morning to
Well,
the day.
well, her Elizabeth Moss Cantor's other finding was that the lack of time, the perception of a lack of time was one. Her second finding though was this work is just work. I'm not challenged by this. That notion that I'm not challenged by this. I'm just doing work. And she thought what she found was that when people felt like they had interesting challenges to work on, it was a lot easier to be creative. When all you're doing is feeling that it's just work. And I think that would fit into what you're saying about today is that people got work to do that doesn't feel like what's the point of trying to find a better way to do this? I just want to get it done.
Well, and
Um,
so much of work has actually been, I would almost say, dumbed down
yeah,
in a lot of instances. Things have been turned over to technology that absolutely have no business being turned over to technology. Um, and when people are not seeing results they can actually relate to,
yeah.
and there's nothing exciting, interesting, challenging, motivational in the day to day. It's just work. Yeah. And how long ago did
That
Cantor?
was it. She did that. She was a professor at Harvard. We're talking research from the 80s and 90s.
80s and 90s. So this is 30, 40 years ago. She already identified
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
oh,
that's what got me thinking about these journals was how can you get people to sort of create a space for their own challenges? Like when I am talking about that concept of challenges, I always encourage people make one your family your family vacation. That's your July. Well, actually, no, that would be about your March challenge because you got to figure it out in March what you're going to do.
yeah.
But that you figure it out at a personal level because that's just as important and it's the same disciplines. Um, but I think that's I mean, I have found that I went through a period a couple of years ago where I had to take care of someone. I was starved for initiative or like I was stuck in looking at a medical system, which I just thought is just really in need of new thinking. And all of the things that we talked about didn't exist there. You know, the people are working hard. I mean, they're really working hard, but some of the systems just seemed like really inadequate.
Well, because they're surrounded
Communication,
by
all kinds of things.
boundaries. Because
Oh,
there's so many boundaries that
yeah,
well, and if you look at the shortages, you talk about the healthcare system, you
yeah,
look at the shortages of nurses and doctors and various practitioners.
yeah,
Everybody is just so strapped.
yeah,
There's no slack again, no slack at all.
yeah, yeah. It makes total sense to me. I think this would be also echoed by a lot of research on that, where you need to have a bit of time to work on things. Um, but it's also I'm hoping that we're getting to the point where executives start to get this, that they can sort of understand this, that there's a great feeling when people feel like they've achieved something well. Um, that's part of this culture, um, owning something. But I know really know what it's like though to be working in a group. Like I was at one of the big accounting firms down in Toronto, National Marketing Group. I was just having these ideas going to other people in my department. They didn't like it. They were they did not like it. They
Well, because it wasn't their idea.
well, and it was more work. They were pretty happy with what's going on because no one's complaining. Um, I had this, then I realized I was having this funny relationship. We kind of got our in quotes clients were some of the senior partners who across Canada and various groups. I actually got along really well with them because they liked being challenged. They were quite open to new ideas. They were uh, like the head of this particular, say, industry group across Canada. They were very open to new thinking, but it was the staff that like my that I was supposed to be collaborating with. They weren't very open, and there's
So
all
does that
kinds of
so
issues.
does that speak to complacency because Canada now, in this day and age, everybody's looking around and saying, we are in a sea of mediocrity where everybody's complacent, we're risk averse, we're floating, we're coasting.
Yeah.
We are a powerhouse that should be doing something, but we're not. Is that what's going on?
I think there's a lot of that. I have on LinkedIn, I've been reading far too many articles
No
of
kidding.
Canada's productivity and
Yeah.
innovation problems, and it's always the government's fault. Bad policy. And I'm thinking, no, it's not the government's fault. You know, it's your fault. Productivity is a company issue.
On that, we agree.
That they need to step up and stop blaming the government and start doing some of the things that we're talking about. Um, like we still make far too much money by selling things we grow and dig and drill. Um, and I'm not sure if I've ever shared this, but I was once speaking at an event in Saskatchewan and saw these giant fields of yellow. I mean, it looked beautiful. I had no idea what it was. Mustard seed. We are a global powerhouse in selling mustard seed to the world. And I'm thinking, well, where is the mustard seed innovation lab? Like, why are we not a global hub for the best prepared fancy mustards that we sell to the world? Like, that's commercialization. It's no different to technology. When I lived in New Zealand, this is where I saw the innovation that goes into agricultural products. Their vision is to sell to the world, not seed, but branded final products. Anybody listening to this, you probably can go to a grocery store and see New Zealand spring lamb. I mean, who brands lamb to a country? It's staggering how successful that is. Um, but they have been working
We have
this.
maple syrup.
Well, but now I'll tell
That's
you what,
one
where
thing.
the possibility is for maple syrup, if you read on it, there's lists of its health benefits. There's various things in it. Now, if we were smart as a country, we'd be selling that as a premium product, like selling it like wine. It's a better sugar. There's not antibiotics. There's sorry, I can't give you the
Oxidant,
whole, yeah,
antioxidant.
antioxidants in it. All these things that are in it. We should have research on this that shows that this is obvious. This becomes a product where you'll see this in some people who watch it may see this in with Manuka honey from New Zealand. Your Billy Bee honey or whatever this commercial for this buy will be $4. The equivalent in Manuka honey will be $30 to $40, same size, because they have shown the medical benefits to it. There's a healing property to it. Now, but they then created the branding, they created the packaging, they got on the planes to different countries to say, how can we sell this into countries? Now, that's the execution side of this work. Like you say, I think we're just a bit lazy in some ways. I can sort of summarize all of this. The CEO and the founding partners of Shopify. I mean, a lot of people know the company. He was interviewed in the report on Business Magazine, and he was asked about as you expand around the world, what are you seeing around in terms of Canadian companies? And he said, it's kind of a problem with our culture. We're kind of a go for bronze culture. You know, we should be a go for gold country. And the reporter then asked them a kind of well, you mean like the Olympics to get better results? We created an own the podium competition, like kind of strategy. How do we get more athletes to the podiums for Canada? And they started playing that. Well, wouldn't it be amazing that if we had a own the podium company, sorry, own the podium kind of program for our companies, to think beyond just what's easy. I would love that idea.
I
Um,
agree. I agree.
this notion about these articles who all say that it's the government's fault, they should be bringing in more, fixing their procurement so they'll buy more prototype technology. Yeah, okay. That's not going to fix, like that's a little tactic. It's, if there's anything, I would love to say copy something that I saw in Singapore, where its government launched an innovation audit program. And it was testing sort of in six areas where it was kind of something companies would do, their executive teams would do. And it was on about maybe 30 different issues, all mostly to do with cultural issues. Are we making decisions that will lead to an innovative organization? They trained people to implement this. They had events and there's a whole program around this. And I thought that was really brilliant because it was around recognizing what you should do. If you do it, it's also recognizing it. It wasn't do you, yes, no. It wasn't that. The criteria they put in there, how effective are you at this? And what they wanted everyone to do is kind of keep moving across a little bit.
Hmm.
Every year we're going to work on more programs that get more engagement from our diverse workforce. What did we do last year to do that? Okay, if you didn't do anything, you don't move across. You had to kind of if you see where it wasn't where too many of these checklists are like checklists. We do this, yes, no. No, that's not how we should be evaluating things. I thought that the notion of how they conceptualize this audit was really, really good. Um,
You know what I find interesting with all of this, Ed, is that, I've spoken to a lot of younger people over the years, and innovation and risk and change and strategy and, all these things kind of have all come together. And a lot of people think that innovation belongs with the young. And I disagree. There just isn't enough experience to be able to think completely differently. But I'd like to bring this conversation to a final point. And you've summarized what you just said beautifully, but now I'd like to ask you for one last thing. What is one piece of advice you would give to company leaders who want to be able to innovate? But what is one piece of advice you would give them in terms of what has to be different within their organization in order for that innovation to take place? Because things have to change. I mean, we're in a world of hurt right now and chaos and all kinds of stuff because, we're out of COVID, but there's just so much going on in the world that's messing us up in so many different ways. So, what would be that one piece of advice that
I'd,
you tell people?
I'd go back to the one point around those two kind of strategies around innovation. Work on the second one, build the skills and capabilities and capacity of your organization to solve problems well. That's training, that's opportunities, that's culture, that's also storytelling. Like some of the things I've been trying to drop in stories that people can copy here
Yeah.
to be able to communicate that. That's all part of that. That to think in terms of your organization and its problem solving capacity for innovation. Most of the stuff that will come out is not innovation. Most of it will be, particularly in services, most of it will be improvements, enhancements. That's all good. But you can also then, once you get good at sort of solving problems and creating opportunities, you can start to push. You can kind of let's do more. But like I said, before that, before you're there, you run into stereotypes like this thing around, oh, the young are just naturally more creative. Well, not really. Um, if you have the proper brainstorming sessions where things are designed to prompt new thinking, there's 100 different tools that will challenge, like to be able to kind of create a completely new and original thought. This is not an age thing. Um, where age gives you, though, is experience, wisdom from seeing different worlds, having worked in different environments. I went from nonprofits to professional services. I didn't realize how much they're related until I realized Membership services is, oh, client service, same thing.
Imagine
Just
that.
it's the same issues. So from that point of view, it'd be go distill it all down on this notion about creating this capacity to innovate in an organization, and that will include some of these issues around climate, be skill development, creating opportunities. Um, you can have I, I did once with the Bank of Canada. They had an Ideas Expo, so they had like a suggestion box program, but every 6 months they wanted to bring people together and to sort of look at this. And it was all to do with rewarding time, giving people some, and we have some speakers, and to make it like a normal, that there's nothing odd about being innovative. It's a normal part of everyone's job. And if, so if to distill it all down, make it meaningful to me. I
Yeah.
may be the secretarial staff. I may be administrators. I may be managers, but make it meaningful on what I can do to improve things. That would be my point.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ed. This has been probably the best almost an hour I've spent in conversation in a really, really long time.
Well,
And I look forward to having another conversation with you very soon. Thanks for coming out.
no, thank you very much. I enjoyed this.
Great. And there you have it, the end of our first podcast for 2025 and the first of many to come. They will all focus on the content of what is in the new book, Tame the Turmoil, how to transform your company into being ready for anything. So we'll be talking lots about strategy, managing change, and risk management as well, together with all of the associated topics that go along with that. So hang in there with us for the rest of 2025, and I look forward to sharing some very exciting speakers with you. Bye for now.